Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from around the planet. Welcome to Creation Conversations. We are Joeless again this week. Goodness me. He can't keep time, that boy, can he? Honestly. Anyway, no, there's a good reason. He's currently preaching at Calvary Chapel Church down in Wales, I believe. I believe it's Wales, I think.
That's correct.
There we go. John is confirming. There we go. I haven't got my marbles. I haven't lost my marbles just yet. Anyway, welcome to Creation Conversations. We're dealing with the fatal flaws of evolution this week. A hot topic, if I do say so myself. But first, we need to go around and introduce everyone. We've got Dr. Glenn Wilson, the Dirt Doc. We've got Dr. Diane Eager. We've got John Mackay, our International Director. We've got Craig Hawkins, all the way down in Tasmania. And, of course, me, Sam, your friendly neighborhood tech guy. And right, let's go over to you, John. Do you want to give us a little bit of a ministry update?
Well, yes. Joe's away. I've talked to him this morning. He's doing well, and we were loaned a car for the ministry because his car broke down. It was unnaturally selected against, or perhaps it's natural selection doing its normal thing in evolution. But one of his supporters stepped in and loaned them a car. But interesting enough, this was a Jag racing car. So it's an interesting thing to see a creation researcher out in a borrowed Jag. And let's hope it doesn't cut down his offerings, because it looks pretty good. So that's good. Secondly, I'm living in a very wet world out here. We had up to 40 mils of rain last night. That's nearly 1 3/4 inches for those of you listening in America and England. Although England is sort of half metric, as far as I'm concerned, and it reached right through the back, up to the back door, but not quite through it. So a very wet night. And I guess to kick the night off, I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of my favorite authors. He's an action author, Clive Cussler, and the latest book, Clive died a few years ago now, that there's probably heaps of his outlines still sitting around. A very realistic author. But you know what I've got on chapter 6, page 2 and chapter 6? Well, you wait till it gets to my section and you'll learn that creation research and other creation groups are starting to make a real impact on certain areas of the literary genre, about genetics particularly. But anyway, more of that later, because we're dealing, as Sam said, with evolution under threat, evolution, its worst flaws, evolution, all of those things. And I guess that's enough from me for ministry. Over to, I forgot one thing. Even though it's so wet at the moment and we don't need to water our gardens, this week our promised solar pumping system, new pump, new waterhead, etc., has arrived at Jurassic Ark, and they've unpacked it, and there's not one bit broken, which is really good news. And in this next week or two, even though we don't need it at the moment, the Lord God is watering the gardens for us, but it will be set up on the big roof covering the fossils, and we'll take it from there and give you a report on how well it's going. Sam?
All right. Shall we go over to... Who wants to go next? Any volunteers?
I'll go.
Go on, Glenn.
John talked about the weather. He talked about the rain. I'm going to show you something. Let's see. Can you see that? Can you see that?
Only just. There it is.
There we go.
Yeah. That's my tooth. Well, it's the crown of the tooth. It came out on Monday, and I can't get a dentist to put it back in. And the reason is, if you look outside my window, we're covered in snow. And there isn't a dentist in the state, it seems like, that's at work this week. So I've been getting by without a tooth on one side. And nothing else much is happening because of that. I've been trying to get in touch with churches to arrange for Joe's visit when he comes here. In about 2 weeks, he's going to show up, and he's going to be here for a month and a half. And I'm trying to arrange talks for him, but the churches are closed. They were closed all week, so I can't find pastors in their offices. So that's kind of my report for today. A little bit painful, a little bit disappointing, but God is great. It's beautiful outside, and I enjoy the snow. So with that, that's my report.
All righty. Let's move over to you, Diane. How are you doing? What you been up to this week?
Well, I've been battling with the weather as well. We've had some fairly ferocious storms here, and a bit of flooding around the house and in the garage and the. But we are getting there. Back to you, Glenn. I once did read a comment where a pastor said that God is very good at bringing whole nations to a halt by just sending soft white stuff. In other words, it's summer in Australia and we're not having snow at the moment, but we do have snow in the winter. But anyway, it is summer, and that's why if those of you who are on our regular newsletter mailing list aren't getting anything, we're not sending them out because a lot of people are away. But we still keep a watching brief on what's going on in the science news and other news, and we'll bring up a couple of things when we get to our main topic about evolution or non-evolution, if you like. So back to you. And
we've got Craig down in Tassie-land. How are you doing, Craig? How are things going at the good old seahorse world?
Yeah, really good. Been a busy summer, but it's interesting. We haven't had the rain quite that the other states have had, which often drives people into a indoor-based attraction. But it made me think when Diane and John have been talking that 6 months ago, the long-term weather forecasters were predicting a long, dry, fire-prone summer in Australia, and it's been anything but that. So if they can't get it 6 months ahead, why do they think they know what's going to happen in 50 years?
I'll tell you what, Craig, on top of that, sorry to interrupt you, but the farmers have been on television all this week threatening to sue the Weather Bureau because they took the Weather Bureau's advice and they sold off their stock to reduce it because of limited grass, etc. And now they had to sell it off at really low prices, and now they don't have any breeding stock. Now the grass is 3 foot high, a metre high, and things would go absolutely bonkers on the farm. So it just shows if people take too much notice of the scientists instead of God, then they can end up in serious financial trouble.
Yeah. Well, the only other thing I wanted to say is that during the week I did another fossil hunt down in the centre of Tasmania. It was one of the few days we've had where it rained, so I got quite wet doing it. But, found some more marine creatures at about 500 metres elevation in the centre of Tassie. So that's another good addition to our map of the spread of buried marine creatures across the state of Tasmania. And I'll show a couple of examples of those a little bit later.
Good.
Awesome stuff. Awesome stuff. Right. Well, I can see people in the chat, so it's good to see you all joining. So without further ado, we might as well kick off our topic for this evening. I believe we're going over to Glenn first. He's going to be kicking us all off. So Glenn, do you want to start off the evening of fun and festivities?
Yeah, and before I do, John did ask me to mention that he had a question come in to just ask John Mackay about flat Earth. And a person made a comment about how since no one described the circumference of the Earth until recently, it must be flat. And I just said a thing to John about how, well, not sure where that person got that from because, long before Christ's birth, that was already worked out. We know about the Pythagorean theorem. Well, Pythagoras developed out the fact that the Earth was spherical and worked out equations for that. And then Eratosthenes, back in 230 BC, developed the actual equations for the circumference of the Earth. He did that just by peering down a well and seeing the shadow. So it's been known for a long time. I'm not sure where they get these kind of comments from, but a lot of what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to start calling up my slides, come from a similar type of thing where people oftentimes hear something and then they ignore the truth. And we're going to be presenting the truth today. So let me get my slides. I'm sharing those now. Do you see them, Sam?
Yes, I do. Let me get them full screen and you're ready to go. Right, there we go.
Good. So we're going to talk about just one of those principles of evolution that I think all this year we're going to be talking about destroying these principles of evolution. One of them, abiogenesis, that life self-generated, is one of the very first basic tenets of evolution. We've talked about that in the past. I'm sure we'll talk about that again in the future, about how all scientific evidence shows that life cannot self-generate from non-living matter, not to mention how the matter came about from nothing anyway. What we're going to talk about today is, I'm not sure my slide's not working. There. Is we're going to be talking about natural selection. It's also one of the basic tenets of evolution, that macroevolution comes about by life progressively developing from primitive forms to advanced forms, and it does this supposedly by natural selection. And the question is that true? I've always wondered why they called it descent from a common ancestor, because they're proposing an increase in complexity with time. It's not a descent, it's an ascent. It should be called ascent from a common ancestor, but then that would defy the second law of thermodynamics. Well, that's quite in contrast to what the Bible says. The Bible makes it very clear. It says, "Then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation after their kind. And the earth brought forth vegetation after their kind, with seed in them after their kind. Let the waters teem with swarming things of living things after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind, and after its kind, and after its kind, and after its kind, and after its kind." 10 times. Every time God talks about his creation, he makes it very clear he created things after their kind. There's no room in scripture for macroevolution. You cannot combine the Bible and evolution. The two are mutually exclusive from a biological perspective because of that. So the question is descent from a common ancestor by natural selection supported? Is it supported by the science? And that's what our talks today will be about. I think evolutionists are recognizing this, so they've really been making a lot of effort to change the definition of evolution to just change, any kind of change. And they're trying to distinguish the general theory of evolution, which is this descent from a common ancestor, to being the special theory of evolution, which is speciation, adaptation. They'll call it microevolution, in that we have no problem with adaptation and speciation. We have no issues with that. God created all his creatures with the genetic diversity to adapt to this world that he said, go out and field. So we don't have a problem with that, but we have a problem with this idea that given enough time, microevolution could produce macroevolution. Is that true? Darwin based it on these finches that had different beaks. Yes, but there was no evidence of the beaks being created, and all of them were still finches. So variation within kinds fits perfectly with God's design. But their belief is that evolution is based upon time. Time they call the hero. This is a quote from George Wald, and he said, "Time is in fact the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible," so he recognizes it's impossible, "the impossible becomes possible, and the possible probable, and the probable virtually certain. One only has to wait. Time itself performs miracles." Well, is that true? No. One of the leading world experts on mutations, a Nobel Prize winning mutation expert, said good mutations are so rare we consider them all bad. Even evolutionist Pierre-Paul Grisset said mutations do not produce any kind of evolution. And that's because of the curse of sin. You know, after man sinned, the earth was cursed. This is God's word. He said, "Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat it all the days of your life." It goes on to say in the New Testament, "For the creation waits with eager longing, for the creation was subjected to futility, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from the bondage to corruption." Creation is connected to corruption because of sin. It says the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. So the Bible says that creation follows the second law of thermodynamics. We talk about it a lot here, that God created things good, but it's gone from good to bad to worse, and mutations follow that pattern. And because of that, it doesn't matter how much time you give it, you're not going to get microevolution to macroevolution. If it were true, we should see evidence of it. And, you know, if you think about, well, what would you expect to see if this were true, that given enough time, microevolution could lead to macro? I like these pictures. They come from one of my grandkids' favorite movie, the Crudes, or Cruds. I'm not sure which one it is now. It's filled with, throughout the movie, all these transitional forms, these halfway between different creatures that we see today, flying turtles and a walking whale and the little elephant mouse. They're really cute. But do we see that in the fossil record? Well, Darwin said no. He recognized this. He said, why, if species have descended from other species by insensibly fine gradations, do we not everywhere see innumerable transition forms? He's right. That's what we should see. But he says, why is not all nature in confusion instead of species being, well, as we see them, well defined? In other words, after their kind. But as by this theory, innumerable transitional forms must existed, why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chains. And this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. So no transitional forms. Now that was 150 years ago. Well, has that changed? These are some quotes from creation as saying, yep, the fossil record should be full of these missing links. They should be all these creatures that tried to live and tried to modify into some halfway in between, but, you know, they wouldn't make it and they would die. And so the fossil record should be filled with them, but we don't find that. And they say this, quote, scientists should discuss evidence that has been discovered, not evidence that's missing. Instead, what do we say in the fossil record? It's largely what Darwin called an anomaly, and that is these living fossils. Craig, I'm showing your fossil here of a dragonfly. I've got your,
I love it.
I've got your fossil here, and I've also got an actual dragonfly with it now, and they look exactly alike. John, I've got your fossil too of thorns, and I've also got the thorns from my yard, which they look exactly alike. And this is what we find in the fossil record. And then this is what leading evolutionists say about the fossil record. Stephen Gould said, all paleontologists know that the fossil record records precious little in the way of intermediate forms. The absence of fossils, evidence of intermediate stages between major transition in the organic design. Indeed, our inability, even our imagination to construct functional intermediates, in many cases, has been a persistent and nagging problem. Yeah, I'll say it's a nagging problem. Stanley said the fossil record fails to document a single example of phyletic evolution. I like this one by Patterson. He says, I fully agree. Oops, let me go back. I fully agree with your comments about the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I'll lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil. That's pretty clear. Now, this is old, but this hasn't changed. In 1980, there was a conference of evolutionary biologists, and this Richard Lewin wrote a review of it, and he said, you know, the central question was whether or not these mechanisms underlying microevolution can be extrapolated to macroevolution. And he said, at the risk of doing violence to some of the people at the meeting, the answer can be given as a clear no. And that's still the answer today. We know this from various ones. Biophysicist Dr. Lee Spittner said macroevolution's never been observed. It's never been observed because God created things after their kind. This is a colleague, Don Sanford, who was also an agricultural scientist. He was at Cornell University, which is my area of expertise. And he was known for developing the gene gun. And he pointed out that genetic entropy plus natural selection rendered Darwin's evolution to be scientifically impossible. It's never been observed because God created things after their kind. And so we're going to talk about the role of natural selection. But this is definitely one of those fatal flaws that we're going to be talking about throughout the year that obviously is not true. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, turn it back over to you, Sam, and we'll go to the
Actually,
next one.
I'll jump in there if that's all right, Glenn, and
Yes.
then we'll pass over to Diane. When you look at people like me, and so often out there they say you were raised to believe in creation, that simply wasn't true. My dad was an atheist for all practical purposes. His chief reason was evolution. It was rammed down our throats if ever we wanted to disagree on something. And by the time I got to third year genetics in Queensland University, the reason I became a creationist was because my lectures were full of statements like Glenn has just mentioned, not given as evidence of creation, but just objective statements about the lack of evidence for evolution, including this one, which was a mind changer. A student, not a Christian as far as I know, put the hand up to ask the professor, a leading expert in Drosophila melanogaster evolution. If you don't know what that is, listen up, Diane will tell you a little bit later. But in reality, the student put the hand up and said, but professor, if evolution is true, how come we can't see it happening? And the professor thought for a little while and he said, well, it happens so slowly, you wouldn't expect to see it happening. Now, I stopped and thought at that point, and I said, what you've just said to my, and I'm talking to myself, was that the reason evolution is true is we can't see it happening, so therefore we know it's happening. What? That's stupid. But that's a summary of what Glenn just said. From that point on, I abandoned my reticence to say anything about evolution, and it wasn't too long after that that I helped set up the creation ministry here in Australia. So, Diane, you've got quite a few things today, I believe, about Drosophila melanogaster and things like that. So how about you take over straight away from Glenn? Where are you, Diane?
Well, I'm here, but I can't see everybody else. Yes.
Sorry, my mouse stopped working for some strange reason. I was frantically clicking.
That's all right. Yes, Drosophila melanogaster, otherwise known as fruit flies, and they have been one of the bases of a lot of genetic research and a lot of so-called research into evolution. But we're going to look at natural select. We're going to concentrate on natural selection, even though we will go into other aspects of evolution because they are all interconnected. This is a very big topic. So I've got a couple of examples of natural selection for us to start with, and then we can go into some, I know that John and Craig have some other examples as well. So if we can go to my slides, let's have a look at a couple of examples of natural selection. Have we got my slides up?
Yeah, they're all up. They're all ready to go.
All right. So let's have a look at a couple of examples of natural selection. This is one we wrote about a few years ago in our newsletter. So it's now in our fact file if you want to look up the details of this study. Australia is notorious for snakes and various other apparently nasty things. And so this was a story that the BBC likes to sort of rub it in that, you know, Australia is this terrible place full of all sorts of horrible things. So Australian snakes are evolving. Snakes in Australia have evolved to counter the threat of invasive poisonous cane toads, scientists have found. Well, let's have a look at what they actually did find. Was it, as the BBC says here, an example of contemporary evolution. So what was going on here, and what was this study about? All right, it was to do with the snakes eating things like frogs and toads, and so snakes will also have a go at eating cane toads. But cane toads are poisonous. They have poison in their skin and particularly in some glands on the back of their heads. And if a snake eats one of these, there is a potential for the snake to die. And so scientists had a look at a couple of species of snakes that are particularly susceptible to this toxin. One is the red-bellied black snake, and another is the common tree snake. And they did find an example of natural selection at work. So this is a real process. And so this is how the BBC summarized this. But for two species of snake, at least, natural selection has produced a defense. The snakes have developed relatively smaller heads and longer bodies. So what they did is they actually measured the overall body proportions of the snake, and in particular how wide they could open their mouths, which of course is related to how big their heads are. And the BBC then goes on, natural selection ensures these, that's the small-headed snakes, are the snakes that prosper and reproduce. Now think about that, because one of the other terms for natural selection is survival of the fittest. You've often heard that line in the context of evolution, survival of the fittest, same thing as natural selection. And so the end result was their head body traits, in other words, the the tendency to have longer bodies and narrower heads came to dominate in the population. So if you look at the population of snakes before and after cane toads, yes, there has been some change. But what sort of change is it? Well, basically, it's survival of snakes with thin heads. The fathead snakes died out, the thin head snakes survived, but no snakes have evolved. They are still the same species of snakes. It's just that because the thinner head snakes can't eat toads that are as big as the fathead snakes are, they get a smaller dose of the toxin, so they survive, they go on to reproduce, pass on the genes for the thinner heads, and so the next population of snakes, they can't eat big fat cane toads with lots of toxin in them, so they also survive. So after a few generations, yes, the body proportions of these two species of snakes may have changed, but nothing has evolved. The snakes already had that variation within their kind, and as Glenn said in his introduction, there is variation within kind. Natural selection, in fact, just decreases that variation. It does not produce any new kinds. And unless you can produce a new kind of a creature, you have not got any evolution. And in fact, natural selection works against evolution because it decreases the variation that you get within living things. That's now there are lots of examples of that going on these days, but it's a good example of how the word evolution just gets applied to any biological change these days. Let's look at a classic case that everybody knows about and that has become cemented in the teaching about evolution. And you've all heard the story of this, industrial melanism in peppered moths, Biston vetullaria. Now, this is a moth that has two different forms that look very different from one another, but it is the same species of moth. There are some that have this speckled sort of body form in their wings, and that's where the term peppered moth comes from. They look like a white moth that's been sprinkled with pepper. But there is a variant where all of the spots, as it were, have coalesced. So it's called a melanic form or a dark form. All right, it's melanin, the black pigment that you find in animals and in humans. And the original experiment here, or the original observations that stimulated this to become sort of the prime example of evolution in action, was in pre-industrial Britain. The light moths were the dominant form. There were more light moths than there were black ones. And when the light moths are at rest in trees, they do blend in to the sort of background, because in pre-industrial Britain, the trees often have sort of mottly lichens growing on their bark. And so if a moth lands on one of those at rest, it will blend in. And that's rather nice. But the black moths would stand out on a background like that in the left-hand picture. However, when the Industrial Revolution came along, particularly in the Midlands and northern areas of Britain, there was a lot of soot and pollution about. The trees were blackened by this, the lichens died off, and a lot of the trees were black rather than mottled. And the dark moths could blend in, as it were, to the background. And dark moths seem to become dominant in post-industrial Britain. So what's happened here is that the light moths blend in to the lichen-covered trees, so they are disguised, as it were, but the dark moths are easier to see, and so they get eaten by birds, and the light moths survive. So again, we do have survival of the fittest. In this case, the fittest are the mottled ones that can be easily disguised. When the environment changed, you get the dark moths being able to blend into the soot-covered trees, so the lighter ones got eaten and the dark moths survived. So yes, survival of the fittest, a genuine observation. And in order to prove that this was a real change, there's famous series of studies by a man named Bernard Kettlewell, where he released moths into different environments and recaptured them and then counted the numbers of light moths and dark moths. Now, this experiment did have a number of flaws in it, and it had come under some severe criticism since it was originally done. That was back in the 1950s. And there was a sort of ongoing debate between creationists and evolutionists about it. So finally, someone, a moth expert in Cambridge named Michael Majoris, decided, well, I'll sort this all out. I will do the experiment again, and but without the experimental flaws that were in Kettlewell's experiments. And he did, with observations in his nice leafy part of Cambridge where he lived. And he eventually came to the conclusion that, yes, this was a real change and it was a real piece of natural selection, and therefore it was evolution in action. And he published his results in a few different scientific papers, but this is basically his summary. Industrial melanism in the peppered moth is still one of the clearest and most easily understood examples of Darwinian evolution. Now, notice he's gone from a leap from natural selection that's been observed to Darwinian evolution in action. And he went on to say this should be taught as such in biology classes. But let's look at what he found, as well as what the observations that were over the decades behind that. The moths are still the same species because the black and the peppered forms already existed in the pre-industrial times. They still exist in post-industrial times in the same areas of Britain. It seems to be really obvious to anyone who closely looks at this. They have not evolved. They are still the same species with still the same variation. It's common sense, but why can't evolutionist educators just let this go? Well, I think we can get some understanding of what's happening here. This is not just an academic scientific debate of what we call evolution, what we call selection, whether it's a case of naming things there is a serious worldview issue here, because Michael Majoris made this comment back in 2004: to have people believe the biology of the planet is controlled by a creator, I think that's dangerous. Now, if you notice next to his name, we've got his dates, which indicates, yes, he has departed this planet. And I think he may have changed his mind about the biology of the planet being controlled by a creator. I don't know what he thought about before he left this planet, but if he persisted with this view of the world, I think he's found out what's really dangerous. It is dangerous to defy the creator of the planet, and that's why this issue matters. It's not just an issue of a few bits of scientific terminology and experimental design. It is a serious issue about people's lives. And if we can just go back to us now, I think John and Craig have some more to add, both about natural selection and about why it has become so embedded in the mindset of people that it's considered to be the ultimate proof of evolution.
Thank you, Diane. And Sam, if you'll switch to me, that would be great. Diane, I'm sure that you've had a good look at the Natural History Museum in London, and I'd encourage any of you in England, you too can go to the drawers where they still keep all the original moths that they caught in the 1800s, late 1800s, 1900s, all filed there for you to see. I mean, it's in one of the research drawers, but it's fairly easy to access. You can do the count, and you can notice one thing that's important. Both black and white varieties existed before the Industrial Revolution. They were not brought about by the Industrial Revolution. They were there already, and all putting smoke on the trees could have done them if they landed on trees, which they don't, by the way. But that's ignored by most teachers, scientists, and textbooks. And if the smoke caused any natural selection, it would simply be to change the number of genes in the population in a percentage fashion, not to change the genes, but to simply change the percentages. Now, some of you may have seen the debate that I did on Fox TV. We did it in the main foyer of the University Museum in Manchester, not far from where these reports were supposedly got. And there they had a big display case with a big display of the industrial moss, industrial melanism, and almost, well, obsequious confession that they really, I mean, the guy had pinned the moss on the trees and he'd fudged the experiment this way and that, but they were still pushing evolution. That, by the way, is why I won the debate on Fox TV. And I'm sure you can actually look it up. It should be on our files somewhere. And it's really a sad debate, because my opponent, even though he was the head of one of the atheist societies, he was so flabbergasted by the total lack of evidence, the sort of things that Diana's talking about. He basically caved in the spot, and I had to encourage him to get the debate going. Now, Craig, you've also got some stuff that's recently come out in Tasmania that we're going to deal with, like quolls and well, no, you're not going to deal with quolls. You're going to deal with Tassie devils. So bring us a little bit of what you've got to say that contributes to this subject of natural selection does not produce evolution, and what the fatal flaws are, because so far you will see why I stopped being an evolutionist. All of these things have become well known if you wanted to inquire, but not through the textbooks. The textbooks sold you lie after lie after lie, and they mostly still do. Craig, over to you.
Thanks, John. Well, one of the important things is that natural selection is a real process, and we're not denying that, and Diane has alluded to that, that it is a real process, but it's based on existing genetic variation and existing genetic information that's out there in various populations. But evolution requires changes in that genetic information, and they say it happens by mutations. And the mutations can only happen in the reproductive cells. So it's not a change, in the genetic information within your various body cells. It's only in the reproductive cells and their chance variations, their chance mutations. So if we can just go to my slides, thanks, Sam. So I have shown this in the past, but this is a sign at the Melbourne Museum that is talking about evolution, natural selection, and so on, and it gets on to mutations, and it says that they're marvelous mistakes. Now, my wife, her broader family, sort of cousins and everything, my wife had to get checked that she didn't have a particular mutation that was in the genes of the broader family, and she doesn't have it, thankfully, but it's caused devastating impacts in the family. It has killed a lot of people in the broader family, and there's no one in the broader family that's saying that these mutations are marvelous. And in fact, nobody that that I know of that has been subject to genetic mutation would call those mistakes marvelous. And they are mistakes. And it's really interesting to me that our whole genetic system, our whole DNA system is built around trying to stop mistakes happening. If mistakes are the way things evolve and supposedly improve, you'd think that over time there'd be a system of mistakes being the norm, but it's not the norm. It's a mistake, and it's not meant to happen. So I'll just see if I can click that through. But as Glenn really brought this up, what does the science really show us? What is the science about this? And there's been a number of scientists that have actually become Christians through looking at the science alone. And John has brought up the fruit fly. Well, researchers believe that this creature has been around for 40 million years. And this is a creature that can breed many generations in a single year. It can breed over 20 generations in a single year. And here we have a fruit fly after 40 million years. It has the most generations of, most organisms, maybe aside from some of the bacteria and so on, but it's still a fruit fly. And what have researchers actually found? They found that over 600 generations of bred fruit flies have, yes, mutations have been involved, but the mutations in the core developmental genes resulted in what? Highly evolved fruit flies changing into something else? No, the science actually shows us that they become either deformed or they die. They're dead or deformed. That's what the science shows us. So the experimental evidence is against natural selection leading to evolution. And indeed, bacteria has been looked at as well, where tens of thousands of generations have been observed. And what does it lead to? Does it lead to bacteria evolving into something else or to highly evolved and improved bacteria? No. It results in defective bacteria with accumulated mutations. What are mutations? Mutations are mistakes. So that's our conclusion. We have to come from the science that experimental evidence is against natural selection leading to evolution. And the scientists, as we've already had a number of quotes from scientists from our other speakers, really brings this out. So when they're honest, they know that this is true. And this was in the Guardian article, which we've brought up once or twice on Creation Conversations over the last couple of years. But Stephen Barani, who's from the Imperial College in London, wrote quite an honest article, I believe, for on this debate amongst biologists that evolution is just not answering the question on evolution. And he says, for one thing, it starts midway through the story, taking for granted the existence of light-sensitive cells, lenses, and irises without explaining where they came from in the first place. So they're admitting they don't know where this genetic complexity can come from. and that natural selection, evolution, is a result of using existing genetic information. And he goes on to quote a biologist from Indiana University, Armin Moshek. He says this: the first eye, the first wing, the first placenta, how they emerge. Explaining these is the foundational motivation of evolutionary biology, and yet we still do not have a good answer. The classic idea of gradual change, one happy accident at a time, has so far fallen flat. They've got no idea, and that's because their underlying foundational principles are wrong. There is a creator. The organisms have been created with incredible complexity and genius, and any natural selection that we see is a variation of what has been created. Now, Charles Darwin actually compared natural selection directly to domestic selection, and he was a pigeon breeder, and he connected the idea of natural selection. So there's got to be selection forces. In domestic selection, the selection force is people choosing the features they want in an organism. In natural selection, it just so happens those selection pressures come from nature. So cold, hot, lots of rain, not much water, and so on. And obviously other organisms interacting with the creature that we're looking at. But we know that domestic selection ultimately leads to specialization and therefore increased disease risk in the progeny. We know that. Just think of highly bred species of dogs that ultimately they can run a risk of diseases and certain sorts of problems. Natural selection does the same thing, and I've had evolutionary scientists say it to me personally, that it leads to specialization in an organism, but not a new type of organism. So as Glenn presented, things reproduce after their kind. There is no explanation of how complex new genetic information arises in the first place. So another conclusion that we can make is that natural selection leads to specialization and risk of degradation of the existing gene pool, and that can lead to increased risk of extinction. So John's a big orchid fan. Orchids, for example, can become very specialized in a natural environment, such to the point where you might only find certain species of orchids in very, very limited locations. And if that location is impacted, then that variety of orchid becomes extinct. Simple as that. And that happens in the plant kingdom a lot, where various varieties have, through natural selection, can survive in a very specific environment. But if that environment is impacted by fire, by disease, by a quarry or something, then that entire organism becomes extinct. It's not upward improving evolution. So a local example we have in Tassie is the Tasmanian devil, and it has this terrible facial tumour disease. Only in the 20-odd years since I've lived in Tasmania has this come about, so it's a very modern problem. But the recent news is actually good, that the University of Tasmania, which is UTAS there, they report that their research is showing that devils appear to be evolving naturally in response to devil facial tumour disease. As such, the gene frequencies in natural populations are likely to differ from those in captive populations. So what they've done is they've taken a whole bunch of devils and put them in captive breeding programs around the country, and those captive breeding populations are geared towards maximising the overall genetic diversity. So what they're actually admitting in that statement is that the devils that are surviving in the wild have a reduced genetic variability. The devils had to have had the capability to survive already the disease, otherwise there'd be no devils, all right? But how do they get around this? Well, they say that they've witnessed fast evolution in action. and an increasing number of individuals with tumor regressions. Now, this is good news. I think it's fantastic that the devils are actually surviving, starting to survive in the wild against this disease. But have they really evolved? They can now, they've evolved this capacity to eliminate the cancer on their own. Well, what the devils have done is use their existing immune system, which is already incredibly complex. It has many, many genes involved. It's not just one gene that's somehow quickly mutated and evolved as a mistake randomly. No. What's happened is that they're using an existing complex immune system, and some of them just have that capacity to defeat this disease. They're passing it on to their offspring, and that smaller part of the population has actually got a lower genetic diversity than the ones in captive breeding populations. So this sort of supports the very points that we're making. Now, just to move on quickly to a couple of the finds that I made during the week. Again, it's Permian, similar to what we've been finding in the Permian rocks in Tassie. It was late in the day. I'd spent quite a few hours searching, but it was good to find these. Scallops, this is Permian rock. It's over 200 million years old according to the evolutionary timescales, and yet scallops continue to be scallops. So my question is this: if you're really honest with yourself and you believe that evolution is something that happens with gradual changes over time in response to selection, you can't argue to me that over 200 million years there hasn't been a lot of environmental changes and pressures on organisms. Then over 200 million years, scallops have produced scallops and haven't changed at all. You've got to ask yourself, is evolution a process that's really happening? The brachiopod up in the top left there is an extinct one. So specialization, extinction, can't handle the changes in the environment. That's not evolution, that's extinction. Mm-hmm. And this was another lovely fossil that I found. I just cracked it open there, and it's got a nice sort of slab and counter slab of a bryozoan called Stenopora or Stenopora. And that's another creature, Permian rock again, supposedly over 200 million years, but they're still alive today. There's a modern one in comparison. So you still have these creatures. They haven't evolved at all. There might be slight variations within their kind, but certainly no evolution. Well, as was raised, if evolution is just changing an organism, well, maybe you can call it evolution, but that's the trouble with the term evolution. It's a very slippery term. Okay, I think that's what I had. So come back to us. Thanks.
Back to us, please, Sam. Give me the screen for a moment while I get Diane to do one other bit that's sort of related to this subject and really important, because what we're looking at here is change, but it's the opposite of evolution. And the biblical picture is God made the world good. The God who did it, the creator, his name is Jesus Christ. His nature is stamped on the creation. And he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So you would expect that, given that what he said is true, you would actually see evidence of it. And don't be surprised, this same God speaks through the Apostle Paul and some of the others, telling you that he will be judging the world on the basis of the evidence that the unbeliever has actually seen. So this is a subject of massive importance, particularly with those who are so brainwashed and blinded and basically soaked up the evolutionary story to the point where they can't see anything else. Now, Diane, I shared this with you yesterday because this item is out of yesterday's newspaper, and it's evidence that the news evolves. I'll read you my heading because you found a better heading when I said it's published by the University of Tasmania, but in the Queensland Courier Mail yesterday morning, they have an article on Tasmanian devils, and they have an article linking it to quolls, but they've got a pretty poor heading, Devil Decline Quoll Link. You found a better title, Diane, to finish off this section before we hand it back to Sam for thank yous and then the first question time. Take that away, Diane, and tell us what you found.
Yes, there was an article in the Tasmanian Times with this wonderful headline: Quolls evolve due to devil decline. Well,
That is great.
no, we laugh at that. Yes, we'd like the devil to decline, and in fact, one day he will, but
Amen.
we're not in charge of that. But anyway, it is about Tasmanian devils, but this is a classic example of a trend that we've seen, particularly over the last few years, of applying the word evolution to all biological processes. And in fact, Craig raised that issue. This word has just been stuck on any sort of biological process that you see. So any change, and change is real, is now called an evolutionary change. And that, to me, is almost a type of brainwashing. Now, what happened with the quolls is that because they also live in Tasmania and they share the same sort of ecological niche, as it were. They look like they're sort of cute furry animals. They are in fact scavengers, and so they are in competition with the devils, but the devils are more aggressive, so the quolls stay out of their way. But as the devils have been dying off, the quolls have been able to extend their time of activity during the day when they go out looking for food. And also, it means that they don't have to move around as much in order to find food, because the devils aren't eating it up before the quolls get to it. So the individual populations of quolls tend to be staying put, and they're not interbreeding with some of the other populations, and so there's been a decrease in the exchange of genes between different subpopulations of quolls. So that's all that's happening, and yes, that's a small change in the population genetics, but it's definitely not evolution. But there's this trend these days to put the word evolution onto any biological change, and I think this is something that we have to learn to be discerning about. When you see that word, evolution, ask yourself, what has actually evolved? What has changed? And is that change evolution, as in terms of a new form of living thing coming into being? Because we've never seen that. We need to concentrate on what we do see. And if we can go back to us, I think we might have got to the stage where we could have a few questions and thank yous.
Thanks, Sam.
Indeed, we have. Right, okay, so we'll do some thank yous first of all. We've got Douglas Boffey coming in at the start of the show with 199 British Buckaroos, a red heart. Thank you so much, Douglas. Very sweet. We've also got George Bond coming in with 20 Aussie Buckaroos. This one's a two-parter. Super chat. As a consequence, there is no scientific consensus on the evolutionary role played by these fossil apes. American Museum of Natural History review: most human origin stories are not compatible with known fossils. And then it goes on to say, overall, the research has found that most stories of human origins are not compatible with the fossils that we have today. The last quote comes from physics.org paper. Thank you very much for that, George. Very on point. We've also got Douglas Boffey again coming in with 20 British Buckaroos. A hippo character stands idle while his new and most powerful body attachments do their thing, with the words OP in the background. I've no idea how to do that one. So I had a sneaky peek over on YouTube. It's like a robot hippo, I think. So I've got to do sort of something like that. I don't know if that's a comment on my weight or not, but we'll leave it there. Anyway, we'll move on. Cheers for that, Douglas. God bless you, mate. I also got Doki Doki coming in with 4 US Buckaroos. Shiba dog gifting a large bone, bowing respectfully. Thank you. Arigato gozaimasu. Thank you very much for that, Doki. And we also got we've got another one coming in from Alex Cox for 20 US Buckaroos. This is all a ploy for the religion of evolution, the deceit to equate human life as just as worthless as animal lives. The dollars spent on the studies and textbooks is just for the psyop to cause distortion, just evil. And we've also got Neil Grinley coming in with 10 British Buckaroos. Thank you very much, Neil. God bless you. Thank you, everyone, for who's sent in a donation. Thank you so much. It's very much appreciated. Helps keep the wheels turning. Helps us fund everything that we're doing with creation research. We very much appreciate it. Right. Okay. We've also got this is so got some nice things to say as well before you go into a question. This one came in from Vikings Cold. Just want to say thanks for the truth. You guys do a great job of putting out good facts for people to hear. I really appreciate what you're doing. So thank you. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you everyone for tuning in. We couldn't do it without you. And also as well, got this one coming from Neil as well. The definition of evolution has evolved, which is very on point. So we've got a question here. This one came in from Zeb Wilson over on Facebook. Question: what is the count for peer-reviewed soft tissue finds in dinosaur bones? Last I checked, it was over 240.
Well, you're spot on. It's increasing all the time. Joe is our expert on that because he's involved in that sort of research himself for his doctorate. And secondly, it's not just dinosaur bone anymore. We are now into skin samples that have been preserved. So there's all sorts of fossils now that they've conceded, hey, there's DNA in here. Let's go looking elsewhere in the blood, in the skin stuff. Everywhere they're looking now. So I will predict it will skyrocket in terms of numbers. You are at the lower end at the moment, and it will unbelievably increase as people realise they can find out an awful lot. And here's John Mackay's prediction: when they can unravel the genes and the genetic information in the DNA they're detecting, they will find it cries out after their own kind, because the Creator Christ has stamped his nature even on the creation. So the triune Godhead means the alphabet of DNA has got 3 letters at a time, and it's amazing the sort of stuff that you can find even just in the DNA. But they're not at that level yet, but I predict they will get there, because the bones and skin are not millions of years old after all. They were buried quickly, which is why it's preserved. They were buried in the absence of oxygen, so there's nothing there to actually disintegrate the DNA except genetic entropy, which will pull it apart anyway. But there's my prediction. Copy it down and come back and tell us when they prove we're right. Anybody else got any comments on that one?
Well, John, sorry.
I was going to say, just a couple of months ago, I sent something to Joe where one of our other colleagues had a list of 140. So it wouldn't surprise me if a couple of months later it's 240. I think it's going to be exponential increase.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, John, you were well ahead of them, really, when years ago you extracted usable ink out of a fossil squid.
Yes, and we weren't the first. We copied an experiment done in the 1800s where they done that, and it's been totally ignored. And sadly, ours was totally ignored too, but that's what we've done.
Yeah. Well, it's just piling on just how fallacious the whole sort of evolutionary sort of mindset is. And just to see, just even in just sort of some simple, just digging up a bone that's supposed to be millions of years old, something that shouldn't be there is there, and yet they're trying to explain it with, oh, well, it could be iron or it could be no. Let's just face facts here. It shouldn't be there, and you can't explain that away with no matter what you.
You're exactly right, Sam. That people say, oh, science will change when new evidence comes up. Well, no, that's not what happens. They found this evidence, and do they go, oh, well, that must mean dinosaurs died out, much more recently than we thought? No, they have to continue with that line of thinking and say, well, now we've got to figure out how these organic materials can last many millions of years. It shows you.
Yeah, I know. When I was I think I remember I was reading something from in a book or something like that from a while ago, and they were talking about one of the things that would be really great for proving the Earth is sort of 6,000 years old if we found sort of biological material in dinosaur bones, which was written before Mary Schweitzer found the the soft tissue in the T-Rex femur, and it just sort of goes to show as well that it is such a massive scientific breakthrough. The fact that we've actually found soft, pliable biological material within bones that are supposedly millions of years old, and this should be evidence saying these bones aren't as old as you think they are. And yet they're going, well, no, hang on. No, they must be millions of years old because we know they evolved. We just got to figure out how it survived for all that time. And it's the, and scientists now are saying, oh, if we say to an atheist, oh, what would prove that evolution wouldn't be true? And they say, oh, well, if we found a mammoth in the Precambrian or what have you, and then if we actually find one, they'll be like, oh, well, no, mammoths must have been around at that time. It's constantly backpedaling and it's just madness. It's infuriating, but
Sam, I've got a really good example of Diane's snake evolution in my backyard, because quite a few years ago, a ridgeback snake or a rough scaled snake, which is mildly toxic, was in my backyard because we live out in the bush, right, just on the edge of the bush. And anyway, I saw it sneaking through the grass, and it was intently looking in front of itself. And there in front was a toadlet really, and it was facing the other way. So the snake was quietly slithering up behind it. And I thought to myself, don't you go there, snake. You will regret that. Now, we don't have any ridgeback snakes in our backyard. They all went there. They've all been eliminated by the fact that we've had a few wet seasons, lots of toadlets, and the decrease in the number of snakes is very visible. The interesting thing, I saw another example of toads, which are not a native to Australia, by the way. We borrowed them from the Americas. We brought them out here to eliminate the cane beetle. Out here, they discovered they liked anything else but the cane beetle. So we still have the cane beetle problem. So natural selection made it easier for the toads to live by eating everything else. But the one thing that has tried to eat them, as Diane said, are snakes. But there are more snakes than just the ridgebacks, which have died out in my backyard. What we've got is I came across 2 dead creatures tied together in a tangle of a fight the other day, photographed it immensely. It's all in my files now. And here is this python, not a huge python, but it's obviously been hungry. It wrapped around a toad, and it was just about to eat the toad, and you could see its mouth starting to open up, and then they both died because the toad had the whole of its whole bone system broken as the snake constricted. But in constricting the toad, you could see it had crossed over its poison glands, and the snake had absorbed poison not through its mouth, but through its skin. And by the time the snake got ready to actually open up, that was it. And it was still there with its mouth part open, toad dead, snake dead. And I thought, natural selection doesn't help anything much here. If they'd have stayed vegetarian like they were in the beginning, none of this would have happened. If we'd never have eaten poison toads, it wouldn't have mattered what they had in their salivary glands. It's not the snake not the toad that's poisonous. It's the fact that we eat things that we were not designed to eat in the first place. So you've got to put all that into the picture. Next question.
Well, John,
Right.
you kind of had me lost a little bit when you mentioned that this snake was mildly toxic. I'm just thinking, is that by Australian standards? Because that's probably severely toxic by our standards.
Well, yes, I guess that's probably true. But in reality, if it bit your dog or cat, they would die. If it bit you, you'd take longer to die.
That's what I figured.
Fair enough. Right. Okay. We've got Doki Doki has come in with another donation here for 5 US buckaroos. Characters saying "you rock" while showing their pumped bicep. Here we go. Hang on. Get to flex my muscles. There you go. Look at that. Whoa. Whoa. Oh dear. And Alex Cox as well said mutations, marvelous mistakes. Mutations are incredibly harmful. Actually, this is a very, very good point. Mutations are they're faults in the DNA, aren't they, Diane?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. One day we should do a whole program on them, but yes, they're evidence that the world is going downhill rather than evolving uphill.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So the audience may not know, but I'm trying to get my scuba diving license. This past weekend, I spent it in the pool getting training, and the first step was we had to swim 16 laps in the pool. Well, I'm a 67-year-old man. I was like, I don't know about this. I don't know if I can do this. But there was a young lady in there, and she just put us all to shame. She could just flat go. She did it without hesitation. Incredible shape. Well, later on in the training, she was eating and she says, well, I was a runner, but I have a genetic default in my hips and I had to give up running. So I took up swimming and bike. But she says, and now I have all these allergies. They've starting to come out as I'm in my 30s. And I'm thinking, here she is in this prime health, and yet she's having all these allergies. She's having difficulties running, and all of these are evidence of these mutations and genetic defects. I find more and more family members that are allergic to things that we never had a problem with in past generations. And so maybe, Diane, you may want to, talk about this more.
I think Diane's suggestion about doing a whole program of mutations is good, because John Mackay is a walking mutation. I was born with the serious defect, pyloric stenosis. I actually took genetics at university to figure out what percentage chance did I have of giving my children this genetic defect. And I figured out it was 1 in 27. So my wife and I decided we'd have only 26 children. No, we didn't. That's not the way it works when you do percentages. But in reality, my whole family tree is full of examples of kids either dying or suffering a long time with this genetic defect. So that's the reality of the world we live in. Things can go from perfect downwards. It's called genetic entropy is one word for it. And it is no help to evolution. In fact, Sam, because my time will be running up by 8:30, let me do my little section here and throw it back to open questions for everybody. I brought in one of my favourite authors today, Clive Cussler. And Clive Cussler writes action novels, and there's usually heroes and heroines and at least one bad guy or one bad organisation. So if you like sort of hero action stuff, as long as you can remember that the first chapter is different from the second, from the third. He likes to set up a big scenario, but I've read most of his novels, and this one is actually called Fire Strike, free ad for Clive Cussler. Get it, it's worth reading, because here we are in chapter 6 on the second page. Here's what it says. Darwin was an expert on the subject of human genetics. Aha, I may not be an expert, but I know a reasonable amount. Genetic entropy was an incontrovertible fact, she thought, and a troubling reality that the scientific community has failed to address for reasons unrelated to the actual science involved. Now, that's interesting, because genetic entropy is one of the best evidences against evolution. Where does she go with this? By the way, Darwin is the superwoman bad guy, if those words go together. She's going to become rotten, and the reason she becomes a psychotic mass killer, well, you listen to what she says. It was precisely this phenomena that had brought her over to the Amazon. Her own research had substantiated the observation that, contrary to the theories of Darwinian evolution, the human genome, that complex chain of nucleotides that defined the human organism, wasn't improving over time. Tick Craig, tick all of us. That's what we've been saying. But I've been saying it for years. Craig Cussler's only just started. It was a startling revelation. The human genome was actually devolving. Now, did you catch that? Now, that's a creation research word. That's the word that Richard Dawkins hates me for, because when I debated him, he said, I've never heard that word. Well, he doesn't want to admit it, but it's the best description of what life has happened. Totally in accord with biblical principles. Adam was made perfect, and John Mackay was born with pyloric stenosis. I'm nowhere near the man that Adam was. It was a startling revelation with wide-ranging implications for science and society. It also had resulted in her being fired from her first postdoctoral assignment. The university kicked her out because she was saying, the evidence is not that, the evidence is this. And she became so bitter, she decided to use her genetics against the world in general and academics in particular. Great novel. I'd recommend that you get it. But you see, that means we are making an impact. The author, the group of people who put together the titles, etc., and the themes have actually conceded in print, at least, that here's a whole field that shows the opposite of evolution. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to pick just a couple of examples. And by the way, for those of you who pray for my wife who's been suffering from dementia, we are really seeing some minor turnarounds at the moment. And go and look at my Facebook post of our therapy dog. She really loves our new little therapy pup. And some of the other things we've discovered are looking really helpful. Lots more research to do on that one, but we'd value your prayer for us. And we are still, and everybody's still wondering what actually causes this to start. I think we'll find a genetic weakness somewhere in the beginning. I've written down a lot of examples of the things that are in textbooks or in David Attenborough, or you hear them from Dawkins, etc., and you hear them from the National Geographic. I mean, you hear them from Scientific American. They had a brilliant article on living fossils recently, and it said living fossils, they are evolving just so slowly you can't see it. And it went through the whole living fossil scenario, explaining how, well, they had examples of natural selection about living fossils, but not one single example of evolution at all. So let me just start with a couple of things here that you probably will recognize. Now, you know, we talked about Drosophila melanogaster before. Well, I ripped apart thousands of salivary glands and that and put the stuff under microscopes because my professor was the world expert. And you had to really be crash hot to get anywhere near what he was doing. But his most interesting comment was, yes, he believed in evolution. He just didn't know what the evidence was. He didn't see it in flies. Flies turn into flies, as Craig said. Fruit flies turn into fruit flies. But there's one thing we did discover. Fruit flies can be naturally selected. Fruit flies and ordinary flies. Like we've got summer at the moment, and the flies are going crazy because there's so much water around, and you have dog plops on the ground, the flies breed in it, and you leave your door open and you've got flies inside. So you get your surface spray and you put it all over the house. Well, in many cases, here's what we discovered. It doesn't work on quite a few varieties of Aussie flies. Why not? No, not because the toxin won't kill them. Get the toxin into their body, and yes, it will kill them. But we have certain numbers of flies that have the thickest pads on their feet in the planet. They can walk all over this stuff and they won't die. That means you are eliminating all their competition till the thick-feeted flies become the dominant majority. Great example of natural selection, but the mutation, the gene, whatever you want to call it, that was there for thick feet was there before you started selecting them. So the selection, again, eliminates. Now, with a name like Mackay, my dad was a Scotsman. I've been back to see the family and seen the family graveyards for hundreds of years, know my history all the way back to the 9th century when the Vikings were trying to invade, and the first John Mackay recorded in history actually takes back our family castle. I tell you what, exciting stuff. But I've discovered one thing. When I asked my dad, why on earth did our family move way up to the north of Scotland? By the way, you can't go any further north without swimming to the islands way up in the North Sea, way up north of Scotland. And he said, well, that was as far as we could run, and the British wouldn't bother chasing us. Now, if you want to know why we so-called primitive Scots could do that, in Scotland, it's really cold in wintertime. And we weren't exactly the most rich people, so many of us didn't have shoes. We were barefooted. So don't be surprised. The natural selection against the Scottish people has eliminated thin-skinned feet. Scottish people have the thickest feet thicker skin on the soles of their feet, I guess we're just like the flies. And they are the ones that have tended to dominate. It means, by the way, all my life I've wondered why I can clamber over the rocks and not worry about having shoes on. I've had thick-soled feet, and I was born with that, as well as the degeneration, pyloric stenosis, which has come from the Scottish side of the family. Okay, I've got down a few other things here. How about lion's teeth? You say lions have evolved teeth so they can kill things? No, the Bible talks about how one day the lion will lay down with the lamb and they'll both eat grass just like the ox. But that's a replay of Genesis, where the lion and the lamb lay down and they both ate grass just like the ox. Because back in the beginning, if you want to do the whole evidence of creation, you have to see the picture from beginning to end. In Genesis, Christ is the creator. All things are made by him. Nothing was made without him. All things were very good. Nothing was violent. Nothing ate meat. The lion has not changed from the beginning up to the creation of the new heavens and the new earth. Those have produced their own kind, because only that reflects the nature of the Christ, who is the creator, who never changes. But in the beginning, their sharp teeth were not for eating animals. So how do we get lions on the velds of Africa chasing down the harmless zebras and things like that? Well, the answer's simple. In the beginning, there was so much vegetable food around, fruit, and you name it, that they could have anything they liked to suit their lion little mouth, whether they were this big or, like they are today, quite a bit smaller than their ancestral ancestors. So what you're looking at is, as Africa dries out, particularly after Noah's flood, you are looking at, well, I tell you what, the food choices for animals decreases and decreases. Now, there's no way a zebra is going to become a carnivore. Can you imagine being chewed to death by a zebra? What a slow, painful way to go. But the lion, he's already got sharp teeth, and he can therefore devolve by choice into killing animals that are already eating vegetable plants and vegetable matter. By the way, lions only eat vegetarian zebras. It's as simple as that. But in the beginning, they didn't need to. So their teeth have not adapted. Their survival is because their teeth were already there. And we've got so many examples like that. In fact, let me give you a good reason that follows up from what Diane said. Some of you may have read the book Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. Now, I interviewed Dr. Michael Denton. I was fascinated by his book because it's a book that from A to Z is, here's why evolution won't work. Here's why it can't work. Here's where it hasn't worked. Here's what you see in the fossils. Here's all the evidence against mutation and natural selection. Brilliant book. If you can still get a copy, go and grab one. Michael Denton, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. I went and asked him, why was he doing this? Well, number one, as a medical specialist, he saw the importance of the truth in science. But number two, he also said, I can see the social impact of evolution. And he didn't like it because kids could do whatever they wanted. Kids could naturally evolve by chance, random processes. And he said, that's disastrous to society. Spot on, spot on, spot on, Dr. Michael. And then I asked him, why didn't he go all the way to creation by Christ, for Christ? Why didn't he go there? And he said, oh, no, I don't want a personal God. I don't want sin to have to deal with. Now, I'm summarizing our 4-hour conversation, but in reality, that was Michael's stopping point. It wasn't that he couldn't see evolution was false. It wasn't that he couldn't see the harm in teaching lies. It was the fact that if you go one step further, then you're accountable to a God who is creator, who has come onto this planet as Christ the Savior, who has died on a cross for you and me and risen from the dead to prove he was God and to prove that we no longer need to fear death because he's risen from the dead. And that's why we encourage you on this program, don't delay. Today is the time of salvation. You need Christ, and you need Christ now. So Can I encourage you? Become a Christian, pick up your Bible, get involved with your local church, and I tell you what, you'll know Christ. And I mightn't see you in this planet, but I will see you in the new heavens and new earth. Back to you, Sam, and we'll take the last couple of questions before I have to leave.
Yeah, just on that, John. If anyone who is watching who may not be a Christian, I invite you to read the Gospels and to find out just who Jesus is, who he said he was, and what kind of effect that would have on you. A great place to start would be the Gospel of John. That shows the nature of Christ, his deity, and then going into Mark and Luke, Matthew. Don't worry about the genealogy in the beginning of Matthew. Everyone finds that a little tough to get through, but it's fine. It's only for a short section, and it gets much better after that. The Sermon on the Mount is fantastic. I mean, you can't say, guys, that anyone else in history has had such a substantial effect on the human race apart from Jesus. You can't say that. Without a shadow of a doubt, Jesus has had the most significant impact on our society, on who we are as people, on how we treat each other. I mean, it's just the Sermon on the Mount is just a poster for how to be nice to someone and how to live your life in the best way possible. You know, and no one can disagree with that. And if you disagree with that, I challenge you to fight me. No, I'm joking. I won't fight you. Don't worry.
But I would challenge you to, if you reject it, the smart thing, if you're an intellectual, is before you reject something, you should read it first. It's the most read book in the history of the world. And before you say a pack of lies, you should start off by reading the whole book. And I agree. If you're going to read just a short part of it, start in John.
Yeah.
But the Bible says that we're not to have a blind faith. We are to love the Lord with all our heart and with all of our mind. And it says to study. We are to study to show ourselves approved. So I challenge you, do more than just read it. Study it. And
all right, I'll bid you farewell to go and look after my wife. Enjoy the question time. And I see there's a few more thank yous to do, Sam.
Indeed there are. Well, thanks very much, John. Great to have you with us. And there he goes. But yeah, just on your point as well, Glenn, that's what I did last year. I mean, I didn't read. I had all the time I'd been a Christian, I've never actually read the Bible cover to cover, and I did it. I completed it. I did my Bible in a Year journey, finished on December 31st. I read all of this. I read. Woohoo! Finally finished it, and I can confidently say, after reading the entire thing, there is nothing that has shaken my faith. It is stronger than ever. I am far more encouraged than I was going into it. I've got far more knowledge about just how everything fits all together, the timelines, and how, even, when you're reading the Old Testament, you see, the points at which you see something being set up for Jesus. You see, the fingerprints of God, wherever, leading, the Jews out of slavery into the promised land of Israel, because that's where Jesus needs to be to intersect, to die for our sins and things like that, to give a release of the old law, be the perfect lamb on the cross for all of us. But anyway, I encourage you, if you haven't read the Bible cover to cover, you can do it. It's really easy to do. And I encourage you, go back and watch the Bible Journey Challenge. It's on our YouTube channel. It is a really great thing to do. I can't, everyone should be reading their Bible every day. But we have days where we don't. We're all human. We have to admit, there are days where either we can't, or we don't feel like it, and we stumble and we fall. We're not perfect. But we just pick ourselves up and we carry on and we keep going, because we know that we are continually being improved through Christ. And that's the crucial thing. Anyway, I'm digressing I got far too excited about the Bible journey thing. But yeah, anyway, let's join into the chat here. And we'll do some thank yous. I see a lot of people saying thank you very much, saying congrats, thank you very much, Doki and Anne. Right, let's have a look. See, so this is an interesting question. Well, it's not really a question, but it's something to jump off on. So Dave Gilman over on Facebook has said nothing wrong with the theory of evolution, but creationism is, I think, is supposed to be is just a pack of lies and misinformation.
But didn't specify a single one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've given quotes of evolutionists that are saying that there's problems with evolution.
Yep.
Yeah. Leading evolutionary scientists are saying there's problems with it. So,
and they need a new theory of evolution. You know, there are, like we said before, there are all these issues with, you know, the theory of evolution where we've got, you know, soft tissue being found in dinosaur bones. We've got polystrate trees. We've got fossils which indicate rapid burial. You can't have fossils without rapid burial. You've got land material or animals being buried with sea material or animals. It's just a mishmash of things, and you don't have a complete
experimental evidence.
Yeah,
experimental
exactly.
Evidence pointing to the opposite.
Exactly.
Yep.
We wouldn't lie to you. We wouldn't lie to you on here. We give the proof in the pudding with all of our scientific research that we do. We show you the results. We show you how we did it, and encourage you to repeat them at home. Like with the strata machine, you know, you can build it yourself. If you get a pump and some sand and some water in a little container, you can do it yourself. Might be a bit pricey, but you can.
We do all this on just whatever people will donate. We're dependent totally on you donating. But as a scientist, I can tell you I brought in millions of dollars of grants. There's just millions of dollars being pumped into science. And many of the sciences will just completely restrict you from doing anything that would support creation research. I know I was an associate editor for a journal who had as their bylaws that you were not allowed to accept any article that spoke against evolution or that supported creation. When I found that out,
very scientific, isn't it?
Yes, I dropped out as an associate editor of that journal.
Yeah,
so that's the reality of science.
Yeah,
Billions of dollars being pumped into it, but you cannot support creation. But we do the research that defies it and speaks out against it on just a few dollars. But we do it with God's blessings, God's help.
And science is the pursuit of knowledge. That is that is the ultimate goal of science. No matter where that takes you, that's how it should be. Even if your grant, you know, it doesn't matter if your grant goes to research towards, you know, creation research, you know, into stratas and things like that, or if it goes into evolutionary science, you know, whatever it is, it should be into science itself. It shouldn't be segregated and saying, oh well, because it's not what science is, you know, deemed the status quo, you can't have any money towards it. Like it's about the challenging of ideas. It's about breaking new ground. That's how science works. It's how we improve as humans. We improve by, you know, challenging, saying it, you know, that's not a great way of doing this. Here's a better way, or you know, this doesn't line up with these results. That's why you see so many conflicting papers about, you know, illnesses and, you know, treatments for cancers and things like that. You know, 1 minute bacon's good for you, 1 minute bacon's bad for you. You know, it's all these different things. But that's what science should be, and it shouldn't be segregating one section. You know. But anyway,
I can tell you other stories that doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Right, let's move on very quickly. We've got this is quite funny from Alec Cox. I found a shoe in my closet without a mate and figured that the missing shoe had evolved enough to find another foot. That's quite funny. Also, as well, we've got Doki Doki. Yes, Doki Doki coming in with 5 US buckaroos, a Shiba dog clapping his hands. Aha, thank you very much. Here we go. And Steve Strangenhoner on Facebook says, Denton sounds like he was wrestling with the same problem as Darwin. That is, he had to accept evolution because the alternative was unacceptable. Too bad he was so frightened of the law, but didn't revel in the good news that sin had been defeated by Jesus Christ for us. Amen, indeed. as well. We've got again another Doki Doki donation coming in. 5 US buckaroos. A Kipper character with stars growing in his eyes, pumping his arms in the air with the word hype pulsating above him. There we go. I can't do. There you go. Stars and pump. There you go. I've only got 2 arms, unfortunately, so I'm not an octopus. I can't do both at the same time. I've got any more questions? No more questions, I don't think, unless I've missed anything in the ones that I've saved. There was something here. Anne said, please will you put up that debate sometime? We'd love to see it. That was referring to the one that John referred to on Fox, I think. Diane, do you know if we have that recorded or not?
I have seen the recording of that, but I'm not sure whether it was ever publicly available.
Okay.
I don't think so.
Well, that's probably something we could potentially look into on our new streaming service that we've got coming up. That's in development currently. If you haven't heard the news, we've got a new streaming service and a new mobile app coming. If you want to keep up to date with all the latest things with creation research, then please sign up to our newsletters. We've got, if you go to www.linkin.bio/creation research, or you can scan that fancy QR code with your camera on your smartphone and it'll take you straight there. It's got all of our links on there. Subscribe to our newsletters. They are completely free. We don't bombard you with spam, do we, Diane?
No, we don't, indeed.
So that's basically the show, guys. We don't have anything else, I don't think. This has been a good show. I think it's been good to highlight some of the key issues with evolution and finding what exactly we can sort of focus in on. I mean, we could focus in on a whole number of things. We could go on for hours talking about all the different things.
There is a question that's just come in.
We can come back to those.
Oh, here we go. This is one that's coming from Centurion 731. Could potentially do this quickly. Question for the panel: how do the atheists and evolutionists explain away living fossils like the coelacanth, which claim they've been extinct for millions of years and yet still alive today?
They claim that stasis is evidence of evolution. The very definition of stasis is no change. So no change is proof of change. I don't know.
Or it didn't need to change, so it didn't change.
It didn't need to change. But the trouble is, if a creature not needing to change over hundreds of millions of years does not make sense.
No.
Including in some of the simplest, so-called simplest in an evolutionary sense, organisms don't need to change. It doesn't make sense at all. Yeah.
Well, again, this sort of feeds back into the good to bad to worse. And again, the mutations. Mutations are faults in our DNA. And a classic. I've just literally pulled this up whilst John was talking from the University of Edinburgh. I'll share my screen very quickly before we go, so you guys can see this. It's actually really interesting. There we go. I'll pop this on full screen. Global surge in cancer cases among under 50s. Global cancer cases in people under the age of 50 have risen by 79% between 1990 and 2019, according to new research. Here we go. The analysis found cancer cases worldwide rose from 1.82 million in 1990 to 3.26 million in 2019. Breast cancer accounted for the largest number of cases, 3.7 per every 100,000 people. The fastest rise we've seen in windpipe and prostate cancers, growing 2.38% and 2.3% per year, respectively. And also, as well, this is from the Cancer Control Cancer.gov US website. Cancer prevalence and projections in the US population from 1975 to 2040. You see increase over the years. Prevalence in the US populations in the millions. So we've got 3.7 million back in 1975, and all the way up to 2022, we've got 18.1 million. If that doesn't show good to bad to worse, I don't know what does. It's we're seeing our DNA is constantly degrading over time.
The geneticist that I mentioned earlier, John Sanford, who was at Cornell, I believe he's the one that did a study not too long ago looking at the rates of mutations, and at the rates of mutations, mankind cannot be past 10,000 years. We would go extinct within 10,000 years. And so we're at 6,000 years. We're seeing all of these genetic problems, from autisms to all different types of allergies and cancers. And so according to his research, we're not going to last a few more thousand years before we go extinct.
Yep, exactly. Anyway,
But that's
that's
something for another show.
Yes, exactly. Time has tuck on, and we are now way over time, so we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. It's been great to having you all here. And just to answer your question, Doki, are you done reading the Bible now, Sam? For the Bible Journey Challenge, yes. For day-to-day, heck no. I ain't done. I'm keeping going. I'm still mining for gold in them pages. As it should be. But yeah, I encourage you guys, if you haven't done a Bible Journey Challenge, it's really eye-opening, and really, I encourage you to read the whole Bible in a year. It is very, very inspiring. And I did it in less time. I started in like March, so I had less time to get through the entire Bible, so I had even more. But anyway, thank you very much, everyone, for watching. God bless you, and we will see you next week, where we are dealing with what are we dealing with next week? I think we're dealing with something interesting. Hang on, I'm checking on our YouTube. We are dealing with mutations next week. Hey, great segue from this one. All right, God bless everyone, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.
Yes, goodbye.
Bye-bye.